The winter of 1894 had descended upon London with a ferocity that even the oldest residents could scarcely recall. By the second week of December, the Thames showed patches of ice along its muddy banks, and a penetrating fog, thick as wool and yellow as brass, clung to the city streets and squares. The gas lamps burned with ghostly halos in the perpetual twilight, and the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the frozen cobblestones echoed through the narrow lanes like distant gunshots. It was on such a morning that Dr. John Watson found his friend and colleague, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in a state of profound contemplation within their familiar lodgings at 201B Baker Street. Holmes sat motionless in his leather armchair before the crackling fire, his long, angular frame wrapped in his purple dressing gown, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the dancing flames. The morning newspapers lay scattered and unread at his feet, an unusual sight that suggested his restless mind was already occupied with matters of greater interest than the mundane affairs of the metropolis. Watson settled into his own chair, with the practiced quiet of one long accustomed to his companion's moods. The doctor had learned to recognize the signs: the untouched breakfast tray, the cold pipe resting forgotten on the side table, and that peculiar stillness that came over Holmes when his extraordinary intellect was wrestling with some particularly vexing problem. "You slept poorly again, Watson," Holmes observed without shifting his gaze from the fire. "The third time this week, unless I am much mistaken." Watson smiled slightly, no longer surprised by these casual demonstrations of his friend's remarkable powers of observation. "My old wound troubles me in this bitter weather, as you well know. But how you deduce the frequency of my restlessness remains a mystery to me." "Hardly a mystery, my dear fellow." Holmes finally turned his piercing gaze upon his companion. "You have resumed the habit of keeping a glass of water beside your bed, a practice you abandoned years ago except when pain disturbs your sleep. The water level yesterday morning was identical to the morning previous, indicating you had not drunk during the night. This morning, however, the glass was empty. 3 nights of anticipated discomfort would prompt such preparation, yet only last night did you actually require the water." "Remarkable, as always," Watson murmured, though he had grown somewhat accustomed to such displays over their years of association. "And what occupies your own thoughts this morning? You have not touched the papers, and I observe you have maintained that exact posture for some considerable time." Holmes's thin lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Your powers of observation continue to improve, Watson. My attention has been captured by a most intriguing communication I received late yesterday evening." He reached into his dressing gown and produced a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "A lady in distress, it would appear, and one who speaks of circumstances most extraordinary." Before Watson could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs below drew their attention. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in animated conversation with someone at the front door, followed by the measured tread of ascending feet. "Our correspondent arrives in person," Holmes observed, springing from his chair with sudden energy, "and in a state of considerable agitation, if the urgency of those footsteps is any indication." Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at their door, her usually composed demeanor slightly flustered. "A Lady Pemberton to see you, Mr. Holmes. She says it's most urgent." The woman who entered their sitting room was the very picture of aristocratic distress. Lady Pemberton appeared to be in her middle 40s, tall and elegant, dressed in a dark burgundy visiting costume trimmed with ermine. Her face, though bearing the refined features of good breeding, was pale with anxiety, and her gloved hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small beaded reticule. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice steady despite the evident strain, "I must apologize for calling upon you so early and without proper appointment, but I find myself in the most desperate of circumstances. Inspector Lestrade suggested I consult with you, though he confessed himself entirely baffled by the events at my home." Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire, his manner immediately attentive and courteous. Lady Pemberton, pray be seated. Watson, perhaps you would be so kind as to offer our guest some tea. The morning is bitter, and you appear to have travelled in some haste. You are most kind, she replied, settling into the offered chair with evident relief. She accepted the steaming cup Watson provided and took a moment to compose herself before continuing. What I am about to tell you will sound like the ravings of a madwoman, Mr. Holmes, but I assure you that every word is true. Something absolutely impossible has occurred at Pemberton House, and I fear that unless the truth is discovered, more lives may be in danger. Holmes resumed his seat, his fingers forming that characteristic steeple that Watson had learned to associate with his friend's most intense concentration. Lady Pemberton, in my experience, what appears impossible is merely improbable, and what seems improbable is simply a matter of overlooked evidence. Please tell us everything and spare no detail, however insignificant it may appear. Lady Pemberton drew a deep breath and began her extraordinary tale. 2 nights ago, on the evening of December 10th, my husband and I hosted our annual winter charity gala at Pemberton House in Belgravia. It is a tradition we have maintained for 15 years, raising funds for the Foundling Hospital. We had nearly 150 guests in attendance, including several members of Parliament, foreign diplomats, and prominent figures from London society. A considerable gathering, Holmes observed. Please continue. The centerpiece of our home is the Grand Ballroom, Mr. Holmes, a magnificent chamber that occupies the entire eastern wing of the ground floor. For the gala, we had decorated it splendidly with winter roses and crystal chandeliers, and an orchestra was positioned at the far end. The evening proceeded without incident until approximately 11:15, when the most inexplicable tragedy occurred. She paused, her composure wavering slightly. Holmes waited patiently, allowing her to gather her thoughts. I was in the drawing room at that time, engaged in conversation with the Austrian ambassador's wife, when we heard a woman's scream of absolute terror coming from the direction of the ballroom. We rushed toward the sound, along with dozens of other guests who had been scattered throughout the house. When we reached the ballroom, Mr. Holmes, we found the doors locked from the inside. Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. Locked? You're certain of this? Absolutely certain. The ballroom has 3 sets of entrance doors, one from the main hall where we stood, one from the servants' corridor, and one from the conservatory. All 3 sets were secured from within. We could hear chaos inside, people crying out in fear and confusion, but we could not gain entry. My butler was forced to fetch the master keys, which required several precious minutes. The lady's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she continued. When we finally opened the doors, Mr. Holmes, we discovered a scene that defies all rational explanation. The ballroom, which had been warm and brilliantly lit moments before, was now bitterly cold, so cold that our breath formed clouds in the air. A thin layer of frost covered every surface, the walls, the furniture, even the crystal chandeliers, and in the center of the room, lying motionless upon the polished floor, was the body of Mr. Reginald Blackwood, a prominent banker and one of our invited guests. The manner of his death? Holmes inquired, his voice sharp with interest. He appeared to have frozen to death, Mr. Holmes. His skin was blue as winter sky, his clothing covered in ice crystals, and frost had formed in his hair and beard. In the space of mere moments, in a heated ballroom surrounded by 150 witnesses, Reginald Blackwood had somehow frozen solid. And here is the truly impossible part. Not a single person saw what happened to him. The lights had flickered for perhaps 3 seconds, and when they steadied, he was lying there, dead as winter itself. The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of London awakening to another grey December day. Watson found himself staring at their visitor, trying to comprehend the extraordinary account she had just provided. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still, his eyes half closed in that intense concentration Watson had witnessed countless times before. Fascinating, Holmes murmured at last. Utterly fascinating. Tell me, Lady Pemberton, was there anything unusual about Mr. Blackwood? Any enemies, any recent troubles in his business affairs? None that I was aware of, though I confess I was not intimately acquainted with him personally. He was invited as a courtesy, being a business associate of several other guests. I understand he was a successful man, well regarded in banking circles, though there were whispers of some recent difficulties with his investments. And the ballroom itself, you mentioned it has access to a conservatory. Were those doors secured as well? Yes, and they remained locked throughout the evening. Inspector Lestrade examined every possible entrance most thoroughly. There was simply no way anyone could have entered or departed the ballroom without being observed by the guests in the main hall. Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar gesture that indicated his mind was working at its highest capacity. A locked room, 150 witnesses, and a man frozen to death in the space of seconds. Lady Pemberton, you were quite correct to describe this as an impossible occurrence. However, I have long maintained that the impossible, when properly examined, reveals itself to be merely the improbable. He turned to face her directly, his grey eyes bright with intellectual excitement. With your permission, I should like to visit Pemberton House immediately and examine the scene of this remarkable death. Time is of the essence in such matters. Evidence has a tendency to thaw under prolonged scrutiny. Lady Pemberton rose, relief evident in her entire bearing. I was praying you would say that, Mr. Holmes. My carriage is waiting outside, and I have given strict instructions that the ballroom is to remain exactly as it was found, untouched except for the removal of poor Mr. Blackwood's body to the morgue. Excellent foresight, Holmes approved, already reaching for his coat and hat. Watson, your notebook and your service revolver, if you please. Unless I am very much mistaken, we are about to encounter one of the most singular cases in our long partnership. As Watson hurried to gather his things, he caught sight of Holmes's reflection in the mirror above the mantelpiece. His friend's face bore that keen, predatory expression that Watson had learned to associate with the scent of an intriguing mystery. The look of a master detective who had glimpsed the first thread of what promised to be an extraordinarily complex web. The fog swirled thick and yellow around Lady Pemberton's elegant brougham as they made their way through the frozen streets toward Belgravia. Inside the carriage, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp profile etched against the grey window, already beginning the intricate process of analysis that would, Watson felt certain, eventually illuminate even this most impossible of crimes. The game, as Sherlock Holmes was fond of saying, was once again afoot. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets provided Holmes with ample opportunity to extract further details from Lady Pemberton, though he did so with the delicate precision of a surgeon removing splinters from a wound. As the carriage wheels crunched over the frozen cobblestones, he leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes fixed upon their client with that peculiar intensity that Watson had learned to recognize as the precursor to revelation. You mentioned, Lady Pemberton, that the ballroom doors were locked from within, Holmes began, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of the carriage. Yet surely such doors are not typically secured during a social gathering of this magnitude. Indeed not, Mr. Holmes. The doors remained open throughout the evening to allow guests to move freely between the ballroom and the other reception rooms. It was only in those final moments before the incident that someone must have thrown the bolts. Someone, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. But who? And more importantly, why? He paused, studying the passing streetscape with apparent casualness before adding, I observe that you have visited the West End Telegraph Office this morning before calling upon us. The distinctive red clay upon your boot and the blue chalk upon your glove are quite unmistakable. May I assume that your first instinct was to contact someone else regarding this matter? Lady Pemberton started visibly, her composure faltering for the first time since entering their lodgings. You are quite correct, Mr. Holmes. I attempted to telegraph my brother, Colonel Pemberton, who has experience in unusual matters from his service in India. However, the lines were disrupted by the storm, and the clerk informed me that no messages could be transmitted to Yorkshire. "Ah," Holmes murmured, settling back against the leather cushions. "And so you turned to Baker Street as your second recourse." "I am not offended, Lady Pemberton. Desperation often leads to wisdom, even when arrived at circuitously." The carriage began to slow as they entered the fashionable district of Belgravia, and through the yellowed fog, the imposing outline of Pemberton House gradually materialized. The Georgian mansion stood like a pale ghost against the grey morning, its windows reflecting the wan light with an almost accusatory gleam. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered despite the early hour and bitter weather, held at bay by two constables whose breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. "Inspector Lestrade awaits us," Watson observed, noting the familiar figure pacing impatiently before the front entrance. "Excellent," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested that Lestrade's presence was more of an expected inconvenience than a welcome development. His methodical approach to evidence preservation will prove invaluable, even if his capacity for interpretation remains somewhat limited. As they descended from the carriage, the sharp bite of the winter air struck them immediately. Holmes paused on the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping across the mansion's facade with the systematic attention of an artist studying a complex composition. "Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade called out, approaching with evident relief. "I confess myself entirely baffled by this business. In 20 years with the Yard, I've never encountered anything remotely resembling it." "The unprecedented often yields to systematic analysis, Lestrade," Holmes replied, shaking the inspector's hand. "I trust the scene has been preserved exactly as discovered." "To the letter, sir. Nothing has been disturbed save for the removal of poor Blackwood's body to the morgue. The ballroom remains sealed." They were ushered into the mansion by a dignified butler whose composed demeanor could not entirely mask the underlying anxiety that pervaded the household. The entrance hall was magnificent, with marble columns and ancestral portraits creating an atmosphere of established wealth and respectability. Yet Watson noticed immediately that the very air seemed different here, carrying an unusual chill that penetrated even their heavy winter clothing. As they progressed through the corridors toward the eastern wing, the temperature dropped perceptibly with each step. Holmes observed this phenomenon with obvious interest, pausing to place his hand against one of the radiators that lined the hallway. "Functioning perfectly," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Yet the cold persists and intensifies. Most illuminating." The ballroom door stood open now, guarded by another constable, and beyond the threshold lay the scene that had so thoroughly mystified Scotland Yard. The vast chamber was indeed magnificent, but it bore the unmistakable marks of the extraordinary event Lady Pemberton had described. Though the frost had melted, moisture still beaded on every surface, and the air remained unnaturally frigid. Holmes stepped into the room with the focused intensity of a predator entering unfamiliar territory. For several long moments he stood motionless, his eyes moving systematically across the space, cataloguing details invisible to lesser observers. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees near the center of the room and produced his magnifying lens. "Watson," he called softly, "observe the floor here, precisely 3 feet from where Blackwood fell." Watson approached and squinted at the polished parquet. "I see what appears to be a fine white powder, Holmes." Holmes carefully scraped a small sample into an envelope, touched it briefly to his tongue, and smiled with grim satisfaction. "Salt, Watson. Industrial salt, distributed in a very specific pattern. Unless I am much mistaken, gentlemen, we have just discovered that this impossible winter was not an act of nature, but a very deliberate act of chemistry." His gaze moved upward to the crystal chandelier hanging directly above the chalk outline that marked Blackwood's final resting place, and his eyes gleamed with the fierce light of approaching revelation. Holmes stood perfectly still beneath the glittering chandelier, his sharp profile etched against the grey morning light that filtered through the ballroom's tall windows. The great chamber seemed to hold its breath as he conducted his methodical examination, every surface and shadow yielding secrets to his trained eye that remained invisible to lesser observers. "Watson," he called softly, his voice echoing in the vast space. "From your medical experience, what is your assessment of a man freezing to death in the span of mere seconds?" Watson considered the question carefully, drawing upon his years of training and battlefield experience. "Impossible, Holmes. The human body simply cannot lose heat at such a catastrophic rate under any natural circumstances. Even immersion in Arctic waters requires several minutes to induce hypothermia, and death from exposure typically demands considerably longer. What we are told occurred here defies every principle of medical science I know." "Precisely my conclusion," Holmes murmured, producing his pocket knife and dragging a nearby chair beneath the central chandelier. With practiced agility, he climbed up and began examining the ornate brass fittings where the crystal drops met the central stem. After several moments of intense scrutiny, he carefully pried aside a narrow section of metallic casing, revealing a faint, dark residue along the inner edge. "Most illuminating," he breathed, scraping a small sample into an envelope. "Lestrade, I require a complete accounting of every individual present in this ballroom at the precise moment of Blackwood's death. Not merely the prominent guests, but every servant, musician, and attendant." "Already prepared, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied with evident satisfaction, consulting his leather notebook. 147 souls in total. Their accounts are remarkably consistent regarding the sequence of events. "Consistent testimony often conceals rehearsed deception," Holmes observed, descending from his perch. He moved with renewed purpose toward the orchestra platform at the room's northern end, his magnifying glass once again in hand. Upon the polished wooden stage, he crouched low, examining the floorboards with meticulous attention. "Curious, Watson. Observe these droplets. Not condensation from the general frost, but distinct watermarks that appear to have fallen from above. And here," he indicated a faint scratch near the platform's edge, "a mark made recently by something both heavy and metallic." His gaze traveled upward to the vaulted ceiling above the stage, painted with Baroque cherubs and clouds. Hidden among the ornate plasterwork was a small circular ventilation grate, almost invisible against the decorative background. "Lady Pemberton," Holmes said, straightening, when the ballroom doors were finally opened, "was there any unusual odor present?" She frowned in concentration, her gloved hand rising unconsciously to her throat. "Now that you mention it, yes. A sharp, almost chemical smell, though it dissipated quite rapidly. I attributed it to the general chaos and confusion of the moment." "Nothing dissipates without reason," Holmes replied, making rapid notes in his pocketbook. "The human nose, when properly attended to, often provides evidence that the eyes overlook." He paused, studying his rough diagram of the room's layout. Blackwood was found precisely beneath the largest chandelier in the mathematical center of the ballroom. Was this his customary position during the evening? "I cannot say with certainty," Lady Pemberton admitted. "The room was quite crowded, and guests moved about freely. However, several witnesses mentioned seeing him engaged in animated conversation near that location shortly before the incident." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity Watson had learned to recognize as the spark of emerging theory. "Animated conversation, you say? And with whom was Mr. Blackwood speaking?" "Various individuals, I believe. Lord Ashford was among them. They were business associates, though I understand their relationship had become somewhat strained recently." "Lord Ashford," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "The industrialist who made his considerable fortune in chemical manufacturing?" "The very same," Lady Pemberton confirmed, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty at Holmes's obvious interest in this detail. Holmes crossed to examine the conservatory doors with swift, purposeful strides. After several moments of intense scrutiny of the lock mechanism, he straightened and faced the assembled group, his expression grave but controlled. What occurred in this ballroom 2 nights ago was not the work of supernatural forces or natural phenomenon, he announced with quiet authority. We are dealing with murder, executed with considerable scientific knowledge and planned with meticulous attention to theatrical effect. The impossibility of the crime, gentlemen, is precisely its greatest protection. Lady Pemberton gasped audibly, her composure finally cracking. Murder? But how is such a thing possible? That, Lady Pemberton, is exactly what we shall discover, Holmes replied, his silhouette sharp against the fog-shrouded windows. Come, Watson. The dead often speak more truthfully than the living, if one possesses the knowledge to interpret their testimony. Our next appointment is with the late Mr. Blackwood himself. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets to the mortuary in Marylebone passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels upon frozen cobblestones. Holmes sat motionless in the corner of the hansom cab, his keen profile etched against the grey window, while his mind worked with that peculiar intensity Watson had learned to recognize as the precursor to revelation. Lestrade, seated opposite them, shuffled through his official notes with evident unease, occasionally glancing at Holmes as if hoping to divine some insight from his companion's inscrutable expression. The mortuary stood like a monument to London's grim necessities, its grey stone facade perpetually damp with winter fog and bearing that peculiar atmosphere of clinical detachment that Watson remembered from his medical training. The building exuded the sharp odors of carbolic acid and formaldehyde, mingled with that indefinable scent of finality that seemed to permeate all such establishments. The attendant, a thin man named Higgins, whose ink-stained fingers spoke of meticulous record-keeping, led them through corridors lined with white tiles that reflected the harsh gaslight in cold, sterile patterns. Dr. Baines completed his preliminary examination yesterday evening, Higgins explained, consulting his leather-bound ledger with practiced efficiency. Most unusual case, gentlemen. The doctor remarked that in 30 years of practice, he had never encountered anything remotely resembling it. The body presents characteristics that seem to defy conventional medical explanation. The examination room was austere and functional, illuminated by harsh gaslight that cast sharp shadows across the white-tiled walls and created an atmosphere of scientific detachment. Upon the central marble table lay the shrouded form of Reginald Blackwood, and even through the covering cloth, Watson could discern something profoundly unnatural about the body's appearance and posture. Holmes approached without hesitation, drawing back the sheet with the practiced efficiency of one long accustomed to confronting mortality in its various forms. What lay revealed caused even Watson, with his considerable battlefield experience and medical training, to draw a sharp breath of astonishment and revulsion. Blackwood had been a man of perhaps 50 years, well-fed and prosperous in appearance, with the soft hands and rounded features typical of successful bankers. But death had transformed him into something grotesque and deeply unsettling. His skin retained an unnatural bluish pallor that seemed to emanate from within, and his features were contorted in an expression of absolute terror, mouth frozen open in a silent scream that spoke of unimaginable final moments. Most disturbing were his hands, raised as if to ward off some invisible threat, the fingers curled like claws and bearing faint abrasions on the palms. The rigor mortis is remarkably pronounced, Watson observed, approaching the table with professional interest despite his personal revulsion. Far beyond what one would expect after this interval, and the positioning suggests he died in a state of extreme physical distress. Holmes produced his magnifying lens and began a methodical examination of the deceased's face and neck, paying particular attention to areas where the unnatural coloration was most pronounced. Note the crystalline deposits still visible in the nasal passages and around the mouth, Watson. Whatever substance caused this catastrophic freezing effect was inhaled directly and in considerable quantity. After several minutes of intense scrutiny, Holmes paused at the right hand, his lens focused intently on the palm. "Your medical opinion, if you please, Watson. These abrasions suggest what to your trained eye?" Watson bent closer, studying the faint but distinct marks Holmes had indicated. "Recent injuries, sustained shortly before death. The pattern suggests he grasped something rough or textured with considerable force, perhaps in his final moments of distress. Or possibly," he added thoughtfully, "in an attempt to defend himself or escape from something. The direction of the scratches indicates downward pressure." Holmes carefully lifted the hand to examine it from multiple angles, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Precisely my assessment. And observe here, along the collar and just below the ear, these marks resemble chemical burns more than simple frostbite. The tissue damage is extremely localized but severe, and there are tiny puncture marks, almost microscopic, clustered near the jugular vein." He turned his attention to Blackwood's clothing, which had been folded neatly on a nearby table. The evening dress was of excellent quality, though the fabric showed peculiar degradation along certain areas that defied conventional explanation. "The frost damage is not uniform," Holmes noted, pointing to patches where the black wool had become stiff and discolored. "It concentrates in specific locations. The chest, the shoulders, and curiously, the back of the jacket shows the most severe effects. This suggests a directional application of whatever agent caused the freezing." "Mr. Holmes," Higgins ventured hesitantly from his position near the door, "the deceased's personal effects have been catalogued. Nothing unusual was found. Watch, wallet, cigar case, and a small leather notebook containing business appointments." Holmes's eyes brightened with immediate interest. "The notebook, if you please, Higgins. Often the most mundane objects yield the most extraordinary secrets." The small leather-bound volume contained the typical entries of a busy businessman, but Holmes examined each page with meticulous care until he reached the entry for the night of the gala. His eyebrows rose fractionally as he studied the final entries, and Watson recognized the subtle expression that indicated his friend had discovered something of particular significance. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, showing the open page to Watson. "A meeting scheduled for 11:00 p.m. marked simply with the initial A, and below that, a curious series of numbers, 14, 28, 56. Does this sequence suggest anything to your scientific mind, Watson?" Watson studied the figures carefully. "Nothing immediately obvious, I'm afraid. Perhaps a combination or possibly an address of some sort." "Or perhaps," Holmes said with growing excitement, "atomic weights, nitrogen 14, silicon 28, iron 56, elements that, when combined under proper conditions and pressures, might produce effects both dramatic and deadly." The initial A brings us inevitably back to Lord Ashford and his chemical expertise. Leaving the mortuary with renewed purpose, they hailed a hansom cab and directed the driver toward the industrial district of East London, where Lord Ashford's chemical factories dominated the skyline with their towering smokestacks and complex networks of pipes. The journey took them through narrow streets choked with fog and the grim reality of London's working poor, a world far removed from the glittering ballrooms of Belgravia, but connected to them by invisible threads of commerce and ambition. They found Lord Ashford in his private office overlooking the factory floor, a cavernous space filled with hissing pipes, bubbling vats, and the acrid stench of industrial processes that spoke of cutting-edge chemical innovation. Ashford was a large man with a florid complexion and calculating eyes that seemed to constantly assess the value of everything they rested upon. He received them with guarded courtesy, though Watson detected a distinct undercurrent of tension beneath his bluff exterior. "Mr. Holmes," Ashford boomed, gesturing to leather chairs opposite his massive oak desk, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Surely not another charity solicitation after the unfortunate events at the Pemberton Gala." "We are investigating the death of Mr. Reginald Blackwood," Holmes stated simply, watching the industrialist's reaction with the focused attention of a hawk observing its prey. For the briefest instant, genuine alarm flickered through Ashford's eyes before being quickly masked by a dismissive expression. A tragic business, poor Blackwood. Heart failure, I assume? The man always did enjoy his port and cigars, rather too freely for a gentleman of his years. The evidence suggests a more unusual cause of death, Holmes replied, his gaze drifting to a complex technical diagram pinned to the wall behind Ashford's desk. Tell me, you were observed speaking with Mr. Blackwood shortly before his death. May I ask the nature of your conversation? Business, purely business, Ashford responded with practiced smoothness. We were discussing a potential investment in my new nitrogen fixation process. Blackwood was interested, though somewhat hesitant about the initial capital required for full implementation. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying a deceptive casualness. And the numbers 142856, do they hold any particular significance for you, Lord Ashford? The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Ashford's face went pale and his hands gripped the arms of his chair with visible tension before he forced a dismissive laugh. Numbers, Mr. Holmes. In my line of work, we deal with thousands of calculations daily. Without proper context, such figures are entirely meaningless. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved toward the window, apparently admiring the view of the factory below, while his keen eyes studied the technical diagram with intense concentration. Your facility is most impressive, Lord Ashford. I notice you utilize a pressurized cooling system for your ammonia production. A very recent innovation, is it not? And that diagram behind your desk appears to be a schematic for a high-pressure dispersal valve, designed to release compressed gas with extreme rapidity. State-of-the-art equipment, Ashford confirmed, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. We can achieve temperatures and pressures previously thought impossible in an industrial setting. But I fail to see the relevance to poor Blackwood's unfortunate demise. Holmes turned back with that thin smile Watson had learned to associate with approaching revelation. One final question, Lord Ashford. Were you aware that Mr. Blackwood's notebook contained a reference to a meeting with A at 11 p.m. on the night of his death? A meeting that occurred mere minutes before he died so mysteriously. Ashford's face hardened into a mask of controlled hostility. I was not aware of any such notation, nor do I appreciate your implications, Mr. Holmes. My conversation with Blackwood concluded well before 10:30. At 11 I was engaged in whist in the card room with 3 other gentlemen who can vouch for my presence throughout the evening. As they descended the iron stairs from Ashford's office, Holmes's expression was one of intense concentration mixed with grim satisfaction. He lies, Watson, not about the card game, which will be easily verified and is likely true, but about recognizing those numbers. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable, and that diagram confirms my growing suspicion about the mechanism of our impossible murder. You believe you understand how it was accomplished? Watson asked, struggling to keep pace with his friend's rapid strides. I begin to perceive the method, yes, Holmes replied, his voice low and urgent. A device designed to release compressed chemical agents with extreme rapidity, combined with Ashford's expertise in industrial refrigeration. The question that now occupies my thoughts is not how this elaborate execution was accomplished, but rather who possessed both the knowledge to design it and the opportunity to implement it in that crowded ballroom. The hand that triggered our artificial winter remains hidden in the fog, but I believe we are closing upon it with each step. The afternoon shadows lengthened as Holmes and Watson returned to the familiar comfort of Baker Street, where the detective immediately transformed their sitting room into an impromptu laboratory. Chemical apparatus appeared from various cupboards and drawers, and soon the air was filled with the sharp odors of experimental compounds. Holmes worked with that fevered intensity Watson had learned to recognize as the precursor to breakthrough, his long fingers manipulating retorts and beakers with the precision of a master craftsman. The numbers, Watson, Holmes declared, looking up from a bubbling solution of pale blue liquid. 142856. Ashford's reaction to them was immediate and unmistakable. but I begin to suspect they represent more than simple atomic weights. Consider them as ratios, as coordinates, or perhaps as specifications for pressure and temperature thresholds. He moved to his desk and began sketching rapid diagrams, his pen moving with swift, decisive strokes. A device capable of achieving the temperatures necessary to freeze a man solid in seconds would require extraordinary precision. The dispersal mechanism alone would demand engineering expertise far beyond the capabilities of most criminals. A sharp knock interrupted his analysis, and Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing a telegram on her silver tray. Holmes tore open the envelope with evident anticipation, his grey eyes scanning the contents with growing satisfaction. "Excellent. My inquiries into Blackwood's financial affairs have borne fruit." He read aloud. Blackwood Bank facing imminent collapse. Massive losses in South American mining speculation. Desperate negotiations with private investors ongoing. Rumors of irregular practices to secure emergency capital. The motive crystallizes, Watson. A desperate man makes dangerous choices, and dangerous choices create dangerous enemies. Watson leaned forward in his chair, studying his friend's animated features. "You believe Blackwood's financial troubles led to his death?" "I believe they created the circumstances that made his death profitable to someone," Holmes replied, returning to his chemical apparatus. "But here lies the puzzle that has vexed me since our examination of the ballroom. The method of execution, this sophisticated freezing technique, requires not merely scientific knowledge, but precise mechanical installation. Someone with intimate access to Pemberton House was necessary to implement such a device." He paused in his work, his keen eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the dancing flames of the fireplace. "Lady, Pemberton mentioned maintenance work on the conservatory heating system in the days preceding the gala. Watson, what if that maintenance was not what it appeared? What if those workmen were installing something far more sinister than heating repairs?" Before Watson could respond, Holmes was already reaching for his coat and hat with that sudden energy that indicated a breakthrough. "We must return to Pemberton House immediately. There is evidence hidden within those walls that I have overlooked. Something connected to the ventilation system and that peculiar scratch on the orchestra platform." The return journey through London's fog-shrouded streets was undertaken in contemplative silence, broken only by Holmes's occasional muttered observations about pressure differentials and dispersal patterns. Upon their arrival, they found Pemberton House in a state of subdued activity, with servants moving quietly through the halls like shadows anticipating further tragedy. Lady Pemberton received them in the library, her composed exterior showing the first cracks of sustained anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, the police have questioned everyone again, but they seem no closer to understanding what happened. Inspector Lestrade appears convinced that Lord Ashford is our culprit, yet he cannot explain how the crime was actually committed." "Lestrade sees the forest but misses the individual trees," Holmes observed. "Lady Pemberton, I must ask you to recall the maintenance work you mentioned. Can you provide more specific details about the workmen and their activities?" She frowned in concentration, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "There were 3 men from Ashford & Sons Industrial Maintenance. They worked for 2 days, primarily in the basement and the main hall. My butler, Stevens, supervised their activities. He mentioned they spent considerable time in the ventilation shafts, claiming to trace a blockage deep within the system." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with Watson. "Ashford & Sons. The connection tightens like a noose. And did Stevens observe anything unusual about their work or behavior?" They located the butler in the servants' hall, where his dignified composure remained intact despite the household's troubles. Under Holmes's methodical questioning, Stevens revealed crucial details that had seemed insignificant at the time. The foreman was a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, Stevens recalled. He made detailed sketches of the ballroom ceiling, claiming they were necessary for airflow calculations. The younger men called him Jack, or perhaps Jacko. He had an East End accent, though he attempted to disguise it with more refined speech. Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden recognition. "Jacko, Watson, we are not dealing with Lord Ashford directly, but with one of his more unsavory associates, Jack O'Malley, known in certain circles as the Freeze for his expertise with pressurized safes and chemical compounds. He disappeared from London's criminal underworld 2 years ago. It appears he has found new employment." "But Holmes," Watson interjected, "if O'Malley installed some device, where is it now?" "The police searched the ballroom thoroughly. Because they sought a weapon, Watson, not a component of the room itself," Holmes declared, already moving toward the stairs with renewed purpose. "The chandelier, we must examine it from above, from the maintenance access." They ascended to the floor above the ballroom, where a series of access panels allowed maintenance of the heavy crystal fixtures. Holmes located the panel corresponding to the central chandelier and threw it open. A rush of unnaturally cold air greeted them, carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of industrial chemicals. Peering into the dark space between floors, Holmes directed his lantern onto the complex mechanism supporting the massive fixture. There, cleverly integrated into the existing winch system, was a metallic canister connected to fine copper tubes that ran down through the chandelier's ornate stem. "Behold, our instrument of impossible murder," Holmes whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "A high-pressure dispersal unit designed to release supercooled liquid nitrogen through microscopic apertures in the chandelier's crystal elements. When activated, it would create an instant localized blizzard, freezing anyone standing directly beneath while leaving the surrounding area relatively unaffected." He reached forward to examine the device more closely, then suddenly froze. Attached to the main valve was a small mechanism Watson recognized as a timing device, its brass gears still moving with mechanical precision. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying a note of urgent alarm, "this device has not been deactivated. According to this timer, it is set to discharge again, tonight at precisely 11 o'clock. He consulted his pocket watch, his face growing pale in the lantern light. "We have less than 2 hours before this diabolical machine claims another victim." The sound of the front door closing echoed through the mansion below them, followed by the distinct click of a lock turning. Holmes extinguished his lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. "We are no longer alone, Watson," he whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "And I suspect our friend Jacko has returned to ensure his masterpiece achieves its full, deadly purpose. The game enters its final phase, but the stakes have never been higher." In the darkness above the ballroom, they could hear careful footsteps moving through the house below, and Watson realized with growing dread that they had stumbled into the killer's web just as the spider prepared to strike again. The silence in the cramped maintenance space above the ballroom stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the mechanical whisper of the timing device's brass gears continuing their inexorable countdown. Holmes remained perfectly motionless beside the access panel, his keen senses cataloging every sound that drifted up from the mansion below. Watson, his service revolver drawn and ready, felt the familiar weight of impending danger that he had known in countless military campaigns, yet this domestic setting made the threat somehow more sinister. Through the narrow gap in the flooring, they could observe the ballroom's polished expanse, now bathed in the gray light of late afternoon. The crystal chandelier hung like a glittering sword of Damocles, its deadly secret known only to them and the conspirators who had created it. Holmes's fingers worked with surgical precision as he examined the device's mechanism, his magnifying lens catching what little light filtered through the access panel. "The construction is more sophisticated than I initially assessed," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the house's settling timbers. "This timing mechanism has been modified with a secondary trigger. Observe these additional wires leading toward the main gas line. O'Malley's work shows more ingenuity than I credited him with." The sound of careful footsteps in the corridor below drew their attention, followed by the soft click of the library door opening. Holmes placed a restraining hand on Watson's arm, his eyes gleaming with that intense focus that preceded revelation. Through the mansion's acoustic peculiarities, voices began to drift upward from the room directly beneath them, distorted but comprehensible to their straining ears. The device remains active. The voice was cultured, bearing the refined accent of education and privilege, yet trembling with barely controlled anxiety. "Naturally," came the reply in the rougher tones Watson recognized as belonging to their scarred intruder. "Though I've made certain improvements to the original design, tonight's demonstration will be far more comprehensive than poor Blackwood's demise." Holmes's grip tightened on Watson's wrist as the conversation continued, each word adding another piece to the puzzle that had consumed his thoughts since their first examination of the ballroom. "You assured me that one death would suffice," the cultured voice continued, now clearly identifiable as Lord Ashford. "Blackwood's silence was purchased. The threat to my business ventures has been eliminated. Why do you persist with this madness?" "Because, my dear Lord Ashford, you underestimate the value of what we've created here." O'Malley's voice carried a note of cold amusement. The perfect murder weapon, capable of eliminating targets while appearing to be an act of supernatural intervention. Do you comprehend the market value of such a device? Market value? Ashford's voice rose slightly before being quickly suppressed. "This was never about profit, you fool. Blackwood threatened to expose my unauthorized use of company funds to cover his failed investments. One strategic death to preserve my reputation. That was our agreement." Holmes leaned closer to the gap, his eyes bright with the fierce satisfaction of a hunter closing upon his quarry. The conversation below continued to reveal the conspiracy's true scope, each admission adding weight to the case he was constructing in his methodical mind. "Your reputation is the least of our concerns now," O'Malley replied with evident satisfaction. "Tonight, Lady Pemberton hosts a memorial service for dear departed Blackwood. 50 guests will gather in this very ballroom, including several members of Parliament and prominent banking figures. When the device activates at 11 o'clock, the resulting chaos will eliminate not just our hostess, but anyone who might have connected Blackwood's financial difficulties to your own precarious situation." "You're describing mass murder," Ashford whispered, his voice hollow with horror. "I never agreed to such wholesale slaughter. The original plan was conceived by a man of limited vision," O'Malley interrupted coldly. "I've expanded our scope considerably. With the Pemberton family eliminated and their banking connections in chaos, the resulting financial panic will create opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. Your chemical expertise made this possible, Lord Ashford. You cannot claim innocence now." Holmes began to move with careful precision, signaling Watson to follow as they crept toward the access panel's edge. The detective's face bore that expression of cold determination that Watson had learned to associate with the moment when theory crystallized into action. Below, the conversation had taken on an increasingly desperate tone as Ashford realized the full extent of O'Malley's ambitions. "The device must be deactivated immediately," Ashford demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. "I will not be party to such carnage. The authorities are already suspicious. Inspector Lestrade has been asking questions about my presence at the original gala." "Lestrade is a plodding fool who sees only what lies directly before his nose," O'Malley replied dismissively. "And Sherlock Holmes, for all his celebrated reputation, cannot prove what he cannot understand. The mechanism we've created operates on principles beyond conventional criminal methodology." Holmes's thin smile in the darkness spoke of grim satisfaction. "We shall see about that, Mr. O'Malley," he murmured silently to himself. The conversation below shifted as O'Malley outlined the evening's schedule with the precision of a military commander. "The memorial service begins at 10:30. Lady Pemberton will deliver her eulogy from the center of the ballroom, directly beneath our device. At precisely 11 o'clock, when the room is filled with mourners, the mechanism will activate. The initial nitrogen discharge will create the same localized freezing effect that eliminated Blackwood, but the secondary system will flood the entire chamber with supercooled gas." "And the guests?" Ashford's voice was barely a whisper. will experience what appears to be a catastrophic failure of the heating system during an unusually severe winter storm. Tragic accident, nothing more. The investigation will focus on mechanical failure rather than criminal intent. Holmes had heard enough. With swift, silent movements, he began to manipulate the device's timing mechanism, his skilled fingers working to disable the primary trigger without alerting the conspirators below. Watson watched in fascination as his friend's expertise with mechanical devices, gained from years of investigating criminal innovations, proved equal to O'Malley's engineering. The soft click of the timing mechanism's gears, ceasing their rotation, was barely audible, but Holmes's expression of quiet triumph confirmed his success. He carefully pocketed the device's key components, rendering it permanently inoperative, then began to examine the secondary gas line connections with methodical thoroughness. Below, the conversation was concluding as O'Malley prepared to depart. "I suggest you compose yourself, Lord Ashford. This evening you will attend the memorial service as a grieving friend of the deceased. Your presence and apparent shock at the tragedy will provide valuable testimony to the authorities afterward." "And if I refuse?" Ashford asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then you become another victim of tonight's unfortunate accident," O'Malley replied with casual menace. "Your choice, my lord. Partner or casualty. But the show proceeds regardless." The sound of footsteps indicated O'Malley's departure, leaving Ashford alone in the library below. Holmes waited several minutes before beginning their own careful descent, his mind already formulating the strategy that would transform this evening's intended massacre into a trap for the conspirators themselves. "The device is neutralized, Watson," he whispered as they reached the servants' staircase. "But we must allow the memorial service to proceed exactly as planned. Tonight we shall turn O'Malley's theatrical crime against him, using his own methods to ensure that justice, rather than innocent blood, is the evening's only victim." Watson nodded grimly, understanding that the game had entered its final phase. In less than 4 hours, Pemberton House would host its second impossible murder, but this time the victim would be the truth itself, finally dragged from the shadows into the harsh light of revelation. The clock in the hallway chimed 6:30 as they descended toward the ground floor, where Lady Pemberton waited unknowingly to play her part in the deadly drama that would either vindicate Holmes's methods or claim them all as victims of O'Malley's diabolical ingenuity. The winter evening descended upon London with particular ferocity as the memorial service approached, the wind howling through Belgravia's elegant squares and driving sheets of sleet against the tall windows of Pemberton House. Inside the mansion, servants moved with hushed efficiency, arranging the ballroom for what they believed would be a simple memorial gathering, unaware that their preparations served as the stage for Holmes's carefully orchestrated trap. Lady Pemberton stood in her private study, dressed in deepest mourning black, her composure remarkable despite the knowledge that she would soon position herself directly beneath the chandelier that had been designed as her execution chamber. Holmes had spent the afternoon explaining his strategy with meticulous precision, ensuring she understood every detail of the performance required of her. "You are certain the device has been permanently disabled?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her black gloves. "Completely neutralized, Lady Pemberton," Holmes replied, producing the timing mechanism's brass components from his waistcoat pocket. "However, O'Malley must believe his creation remains operational until the precise moment of revelation. Your courage tonight will serve not only justice, but the safety of every soul who enters that ballroom." Inspector Lestrade arrived as darkness fell, bringing with him 6 plainclothes constables who would blend seamlessly among the evening's gathering. Holmes positioned them with the strategic precision of a military commander, 2 disguised as additional footmen, 2 as musicians, and 2 among the invited guests themselves. Each man understood his role perfectly, to remain motionless until Holmes's signal, then move with coordinated efficiency to prevent any escape. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, this makes me profoundly uneasy," Lestrade admitted as they reviewed the final arrangements. Using innocent civilians as unwitting participants in such a dangerous game goes against every instinct of proper police procedure. The danger has been eliminated, Lestrade, Holmes assured him, his grey eyes bright with that intense focus Watson had learned to associate with approaching triumph. What remains is theatre, a performance designed to expose the truth that conventional investigation could never prove. O'Malley's arrogance will compel him to witness what he believes will be his masterpiece of scientific murder. As the clock struck 9:30, carriages began arriving through the swirling snow, depositing London's elite into the warm glow of the mansion's entrance hall. Holmes and Watson had positioned themselves in the conservatory, from where they could observe both the ballroom and the servants' corridors. Through the glass doors, they watched the gathering mourners take their seats in neat rows before the black-draped podium, their conversations creating a low murmur of respectful sympathy. Lord Ashford arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, his usually florid complexion now pale as winter moonlight. Holmes observed the industrialist's behavior with grim satisfaction, noting how his eyes darted constantly toward the ballroom ceiling, how his hands shook as he accepted a glass of sherry from a passing servant, how he avoided direct conversation with other guests as if fearing his guilt might be read in his expression. "Fear is a powerful revealer of truth, Watson," Holmes murmured, adjusting his position to maintain clear sight lines throughout the room. "Observe how Ashford positions himself near the main entrance, close enough to flee at the first sign of discovery, yet compelled to remain by O'Malley's threats and his own morbid fascination with the approaching catastrophe." At 10:45, Lady Pemberton entered the ballroom with dignified composure, moving toward the podium with steady steps that betrayed none of her inner turmoil. The assembled mourners rose respectfully, their black-clad figures creating a somber tableau beneath the glittering chandelier that concealed its deadly secret. Holmes's attention, however, was focused not on the speaker but on a tall figure who had materialized near the servants' entrance, a man in footman's livery whose scarred features were partially concealed by carefully applied theatrical makeup. "O'Malley," Watson breathed, his hand moving instinctively toward his concealed revolver. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice carrying a note of cold satisfaction. "Observe his positioning, close enough to the exits to ensure escape, yet with a clear view of the chandelier above Lady Pemberton's head. He expects to witness the triumph of his scientific artistry, the perfect fusion of chemistry and murder that will establish his reputation among London's criminal elite." The memorial service began with traditional solemnity, the vicar's words echoing through the vaulted chamber while the assembled mourners listened with appropriate reverence. Lady Pemberton delivered her eulogy with remarkable poise, speaking movingly of Blackwood's charitable contributions while standing precisely where O'Malley expected her to die. Holmes watched the criminal's face intently, noting the anticipatory gleam in his eyes as the clock hands crept inexorably toward 11. As the final minutes approached, the tension in the ballroom became almost palpable. O'Malley's hand rested casually inside his coat, undoubtedly grasping some device he believed would trigger the mechanism remotely. Lord Ashford sat frozen in his chair, his breath coming in short gasps as he awaited the catastrophe his greed had set in motion. The other mourners continued their respectful attention to Lady Pemberton's words, blissfully unaware that they were participants in a deadly drama. The great clock in the entrance hall began to chime 11, its sonorous tones carrying through the mansion like the countdown to judgment. Holmes tensed, his keen eyes fixed on O'Malley's increasingly confused expression as the seconds passed without the expected hiss of releasing gas or the screams of freezing victims. At the 11th chime, when the ballroom should have become a chamber of death, Holmes stepped forward from the conservatory entrance, his voice cutting through the solemn atmosphere with the authority of revealed truth. "The performance concludes, Mr. O'Malley, but I fear the finale differs considerably from your original script." The collective intake of breath from the assembled mourners created a sound like wind through autumn leaves as every head turned toward Holmes's commanding figure. O'Malley's scarred face contorted with shock and fury, his hand emerging from his coat, clutching a small brass device bristling with switches and copper wires. The device that should have unleashed death upon the gathered innocents remained stubbornly silent, its mechanisms as cold and lifeless as winter stone. "You meddle in affairs beyond your comprehension, Holmes," O'Malley snarled, his carefully maintained disguise falling away to reveal the brutal criminal beneath. "That mechanism should have activated regardless of your interference." Holmes advanced with measured steps, producing the dismantled timing components from his waistcoat pocket. "Your masterpiece of scientific murder suffered from a fatal flaw, Mr. O'Malley. Specifically, the removal of its essential mechanisms approximately 6 hours ago. Your elaborate chandelier now contains nothing more dangerous than empty copper tubing and disconnected canisters." The effect upon the two conspirators was immediate and devastating. Lord Ashford rose from his chair with a strangled cry, his face cycling through relief and despair as the full implications struck him. O'Malley's eyes darted frantically around the ballroom, calculating distances and possibilities before his hand moved toward his waistcoat with desperate speed. Watson's service revolver appeared with military precision, its barrel leveled steadily at the criminal's chest. "I would strongly advise against any precipitous action," Watson said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of battlefield command. "He forced me into this madness," Ashford shouted suddenly, pointing an accusatory finger at O'Malley. "Blackwood's death was meant to solve a business problem, not become the prelude to wholesale slaughter." "How touching that you draw moral distinctions between single murder and mass killing," Holmes observed with cold irony, "as if the former were somehow more acceptable. Your participation makes you equally culpable, Lord Ashford, regardless of subsequent elaborations." Lestrade's constables moved with coordinated precision, surrounding both men while the bewildered mourners pressed against the walls. O'Malley made one final desperate lunge toward the servants' entrance, but found himself tackled by two officers who had anticipated precisely such a move. The brief struggle ended with the satisfying click of handcuffs securing his wrists. "Perhaps you would enlighten these good people as to how you unraveled our carefully constructed impossibility," O'Malley said with forced bravado, though his eyes betrayed the desperation of a cornered predator. Holmes moved to stand beneath the great chandelier, gesturing upward to its glittering expanse. "Mr. Reginald Blackwood was murdered by a precisely engineered device installed within this fixture during your supposed maintenance work. The mechanism consisted of high-pressure canisters containing liquid nitrogen, connected to microscopic apertures concealed within the crystal elements." He produced his notebook, displaying technical sketches. The numbers in Blackwood's diary, 14, 28, 56, were not atomic weights, as I initially theorized, but operational parameters: 14 atmospheres of pressure, 28 seconds of sustained release, and 56 degrees below 0 Celsius. Blackwood recognized these specifications from his investments in Ashford's chemical enterprises. Lady Pemberton, pale but composed, found her voice. Then the impossible freezing was entirely artificial, Holmes confirmed. When activated, the apertures released supercooled gas in a concentrated stream, creating an instant localized blizzard that froze the victim while leaving the surrounding area relatively unaffected. The locked doors, flickering lights, and sudden cold were theatrical elements designed to suggest supernatural intervention rather than calculated murder. Lord Ashford's shoulders sagged in defeat as Holmes continued his inexorable reconstruction. "Blackwood discovered your scheme and arranged a meeting, marked simply as A in his diary, to negotiate silence in exchange for capital to save his failing bank. But you could not risk his continued existence, regardless of any agreement." Holmes produced a small brass remote trigger that matched O'Malley's device. "This was recovered from the servants' corridor during my initial investigation. Your fingerprints are quite distinct upon its surface, Mr. O'Malley, and they match perfectly with prints found on the installation components." "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes announced formally, I believe you have sufficient evidence to charge both Lord Ashford and Jack O'Malley with the premeditated murder of Reginald Blackwood, as well as conspiracy to commit multiple murders through tonight's intended massacre. As the constables led the prisoners away, O'Malley cursing bitterly and Ashford weeping in broken silence, Holmes turned to the assembled witnesses. "The device above us remains intact as physical evidence, gentlemen. What appeared impossible was merely improbable, and what seemed supernatural was simply the application of industrial chemistry to criminal purpose." The great clock chimed the quarter hour as order slowly returned to the ballroom. Holmes stood quietly amid the subsiding chaos, his sharp profile illuminated by gaslight, having once again transformed the impossible into the inevitable through the inexorable application of logic, observation, and scientific method. The frozen ballroom had yielded its secrets at last. The pale winter sun struggled through London's perpetual fog as Holmes and Watson returned to their familiar lodgings at Baker Street, where the detective immediately transformed their sitting room into an impromptu laboratory for examining the dismantled components of O'Malley's elaborate murder device. Brass fittings, copper tubing, and delicate pressure valves lay scattered across Holmes's chemical table, each piece bearing witness to the twisted ingenuity that had nearly claimed dozens of innocent lives. "The mechanism itself represents genuine engineering brilliance," Holmes observed, holding a miniature dispersal valve to the morning light. "O'Malley possessed the technical knowledge to revolutionize industrial refrigeration, yet chose to apply his talents toward theatrical murder. The tragedy lies not merely in his victims, but in the perversion of scientific advancement." Watson set down his pen from where he had been recording their latest adventure and regarded the mechanical evidence with professional interest. For all its sophistication, the device ultimately failed in its intended purpose. Your intervention transformed what should have been London's most shocking massacre into justice triumphant. A sharp knock interrupted their analysis, and Inspector Lestrade entered bearing the satisfied expression of a man whose case had concluded successfully. The Scotland Yard detective carried official documents and news from the magistrate's office that would complete the legal resolution of the Pemberton House affair. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted them warmly, accepting the offered chair near their fire. "Both Ashford and O'Malley have been formally charged with murder and conspiracy. Their separate confessions corroborate every detail of your reconstruction, though each naturally attempts to minimize his own culpability. The inevitable result when criminals discover that loyalty among thieves extends only as far as the dock," Holmes replied, returning to his examination of the valve assembly. "Ashford claims he sought only simple poisoning to silence Blackwood's threats, while O'Malley insisted upon his elaborate freezing demonstration to establish his reputation as London's premier technical assassin." Lestrade consulted his notes with evident satisfaction. Blackwood's financial situation was indeed catastrophic. His bank was within days of complete collapse. He had made unauthorized investments using depositors' funds in those failed South American mining ventures that Ashford had initially financed through his chemical company. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes reflecting the dancing flames of their morning fire. Blackwood recognized the operational parameters: 14 atmospheres pressure, 28 seconds sustained release, 56 degrees below zero, from the industrial processes he had helped finance. His diary notation served as both appointment record and insurance policy, though ultimately insufficient protection against his partner's desperation. "What of the device's precise composition?" Watson inquired, his medical training prompting technical curiosity about the murder method. "Not pure nitrogen as initially suspected," Holmes replied, producing a small sample vial. The mixture involved compressed argon, hence the double meaning of A in Blackwood's diary. It explains the unusual blue tint of the victim's skin and the specific crystalline frost patterns. A small detail, perhaps, but one that confirms the elegance of our solution. As Lestrade prepared to depart, he shook hands with both men warmly. London owes you a considerable debt, Mr. Holmes. Without your intervention, last evening would have witnessed unprecedented tragedy. The prosecution believes your testimony, combined with the mechanical evidence and the defendant's confessions, will ensure convictions on all charges. After the inspector's departure, Holmes settled into his armchair with his pipe while Watson returned to his manuscript. The comfortable silence of long companionship filled their sitting room as afternoon shadows lengthened across the familiar furnishings that had witnessed so many similar conclusions to their investigations. An interesting case, Watson, Holmes mused, smoke curling thoughtfully from his pipe, though ultimately more about human weakness than criminal innovation. Ashford's greed, Blackwood's desperation, O'Malley's vanity, the eternal trinity of motives that drive men toward destruction. Watson looked up from his writing, his pen poised above the page that would preserve their latest adventure for posterity. Yet the method itself was genuinely unprecedented. The application of industrial chemistry to create an impossible crime surely represents something novel in criminal behavior. Novel in execution, perhaps, but ancient in conception, Holmes replied philosophically. Criminals have always sought to disguise murder as accident or supernatural phenomenon. O'Malley simply possessed the technical knowledge to achieve what others could only imagine. The frozen ballroom was merely the latest iteration of humanity's eternal attempt to commit the perfect crime. The fire crackled softly as darkness settled over Baker Street, and Watson returned to his chronicling while Holmes's keen mind already turned toward future mysteries. The case of the frozen ballroom had been filed away among countless puzzles solved through the application of logic, observation, and that peculiar genius that transformed the impossible into the inevitable. Outside their window, London continued its endless rhythm, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped a demonstration of scientific murder that would have shocked the civilized world. Within their familiar sanctuary, however, the game continued as always, with new challenges waiting in the test tubes and retorts that promised fresh intellectual adventures for the world's first consulting detective. The winter storm that had gripped London for days finally broke on the morning following the arrests, leaving the city washed clean under a crisp, bright sky that seemed to mirror the clarity Holmes had brought to the Pemberton affair. Sunlight streamed through the windows of 221B Baker Street, illuminating the dismantled components of O'Malley's deadly device, now packed into wooden crates destined for Scotland Yard's archives as evidence of criminal ingenuity thwarted by superior deduction. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his lean frame silhouetted against the dancing flames, while Watson completed his manuscript at the familiar writing desk. The detective's gray eyes held that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that Watson had learned to associate with the conclusion of their more significant cases. "You realize, Watson," Holmes remarked, tapping his pipe thoughtfully against the mantelpiece, "that our adventure has likely prevented not merely individual tragedy, but institutional collapse. Had Ashford's scheme succeeded, Blackwood's bank failure would have triggered a financial panic affecting thousands of innocent depositors." Watson looked up from his nearly completed narrative, his expression thoughtful. "The web of corruption extended far beyond our immediate investigation, didn't it?" "Indeed," Holmes confirmed, moving to his desk where a leather portfolio lay open, revealing documents marked with his characteristic spidery annotations. "My morning at Somerset House revealed that Blackwood's fraudulent investments involved at least 7 other prominent figures, including 2 members of Parliament and a High Court judge. The frozen ballroom was merely the dramatic culmination of much deeper institutional rot." A gentle knock interrupted their discussion, and Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing an elegant card upon her silver tray. Holmes examined it briefly before nodding his approval. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson. Lady Pemberton's visit is most timely." Their former client entered with considerably more composure than her initial. Desperate appearance, dressed in deep purple mourning attire that spoke of dignity maintained through adversity. She carried a small wrapped package and bore the demeanor of a woman who had weathered considerable storm and emerged with renewed strength. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson?" She greeted them warmly, accepting the offered chair. "I come bearing gratitude and seeking your counsel on a delicate matter that has emerged from the investigation's aftermath." Holmes steepled his fingers in that characteristic gesture of concentrated attention. "You have discovered troubling connections between your late husband and the fraudulent investments." Relief flooded Lady Pemberton's features at his understanding. "Yes, though I pray you can establish his innocence in these schemes. Our family's reputation hangs in the balance." Holmes produced one of his documents indicating specific entries highlighted in red ink. "Your husband's correspondence demonstrates consistent requests for proper documentation and independent verification. Requests that were systematically denied by Blackwood and his associates. His investment pattern shows the behavior of a cautious man being deliberately misled, not a willing participant in fraud." She accepted the evidence with trembling hands, tears of gratitude glistening in her eyes. Alongside the documents, she placed her wrapped package upon the table, a magnificent silver cigarette case engraved simply, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who brought light to our darkest winter." "Justice requires no elaborate thanks," Holmes said quietly, though his tone carried uncharacteristic warmth. "The truth serves its own purpose, regardless of sentiment. Your husband was an honorable man deceived by dishonorable associates. That truth deserves preservation as much as the exposure of criminal conspiracy." After Lady Pemberton's grateful departure, the afternoon settled into comfortable silence. Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a melancholy air that seemed to capture both the satisfaction of justice achieved and the lingering recognition of human corruption exposed. "You have been unusually generous in this case," Watson observed, setting aside his pen. "Providing evidence that clears Lord Pemberton's name extended well beyond our original commission." Holmes paused in his playing, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight with unusual depth. "Justice, Watson, consists not merely in punishing the guilty, but in protecting the innocent from undeserved consequences. The complete solution requires both elements. We have seen how industrial progress provides new tools for ancient sins, how greed can freeze the human heart more effectively than any chemical agent." The melody shifted into something lighter, a complex variation that filled the room with vibrant energy. "So concludes the case of the frozen ballroom," Holmes declared. "The impossible has once again revealed itself as merely the improbable, and order has been restored to our corner of Victorian London." Outside, the sounds of London life continued, the rattle of carriages, the cries of street vendors, the distant whistle of trains departing for unknown destinations. The world moved forward, indifferent to the dramas played out in its shadows, but within the walls of 2T1B Baker Street, vigilance remained constant. Holmes finished his impromptu concert with a flourish, setting the violin aside with sudden restlessness. "Pass me the agony column, Watson. I perceive a most singular advertisement regarding a missing botanist and a collection of rare orchids. Unless I am much mistaken, spring brings with it new and interesting complications." And so the cycle began anew, as constant and predictable as the tides, ensuring that the legend of Sherlock Holmes would continue to grow with each fresh challenge that crossed their threshold. The frozen ballroom was now history. The next adventure awaited in London's endless fog. The pale March sunlight filtering through the windows of 221B Baker Street illuminated the final pages of Watson's manuscript as he struggled to capture both the technical brilliance and moral complexity of the case that had consumed their winter. Holmes sat nearby, his chemical apparatus arranged with meticulous precision, though his grey eyes occasionally drifted toward his companion's work with that peculiar mixture of interest and detachment that Watson had learned to recognize as approval. "You find difficulty in describing O'Malley's mechanism without overwhelming the reader with technical minutiae," Holmes observed, not looking up from his current experiment, a foul-smelling orange precipitate that seemed to fascinate him entirely. Watson set down his pen with evident frustration. It is the moral dimension that troubles me most, Holmes. Such scientific brilliance perverted to the service of murder. O'Malley possessed the knowledge to revolutionize industrial refrigeration, to preserve food supplies, to advance medical science. Instead, he chose to freeze men's hearts, literally and figuratively. Holmes paused in his work, his keen features reflecting the morning light as he considered his friend's observation. Crime is often the misapplication of genius, Watson. Every advance in human knowledge provides fresh tools for both creation and destruction. The printing press spreads enlightenment and libel with equal facility. The telegraph unites nations and carries the orders that begin wars. Chemistry gives us improved medicine and theatrical murder in the same breath. Before Watson could respond, Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock interrupted their philosophical discourse. She entered bearing a card upon her silver tray, her expression suggesting a visitor of particular respectability. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She says her business concerns the Blackwood matter and will not be denied." The woman who entered their sitting room possessed the unmistakable bearing of educated determination, tempered by recent grief. Perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in modest but respectable attire that spoke of professional employment, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of one who had weathered considerable storm. Her introduction as Miss Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of the murdered banker, immediately commanded Holmes's complete attention. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice steady despite evident emotion, "the newspapers have reported my father's death as the result of criminal conspiracy, yet they speak of financial irregularities and business disputes that suggest equal culpability among all parties. I have come seeking complete truth, regardless of personal pain." She withdrew a leather portfolio from her satchel, opening it to reveal meticulous financial records written in a precise feminine hand. "I served as my father's private secretary for 5 years, maintaining records he kept separate from the bank's official ledgers. These documents prove that he discovered Lord Ashford's fraudulent investment scheme 3 months ago and had been attempting to repair the damage without triggering complete financial collapse." Holmes accepted the portfolio with uncharacteristic solemnity, his keen eyes scanning the carefully maintained accounts. The records revealed a pattern of systematic effort to undo damage caused by others. £40,000 of personal fortune quietly used to reimburse defrauded depositors. Careful documentation of Ashford's crimes and detailed plans for managed disclosure that would protect innocent investors while exposing the guilty parties. "Your father was not seeking to blackmail Ashford," Holmes concluded, "but offering him final opportunity for confession and restitution before exposure became inevitable." "Precisely," Miss Blackwood confirmed, tears now flowing freely down her composed features. "He was murdered not for his crimes, but for his virtues. His integrity made him dangerous to men whose greed had consumed their conscience." Watson observed the exchange with growing understanding of the case's true moral dimensions. Then Blackwood's final meeting with A was an attempt at redemption rather than extortion. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his mind clearly reassessing the case's complete implications. "Your father's nobility cost him his life, Miss Blackwood. This documentation transforms our understanding entirely. Ashford and O'Malley murdered not a co-conspirator seeking escape, but a witness whose testimony would have exposed systematic fraud." After providing assurances that her father's true character would be properly represented to both court and press, Miss Blackwood departed with evident relief. Holmes carefully secured her evidence in his safe, then returned to his desk where he produced a small brass component Watson had not seen before. "There remains one final technical detail," Holmes said, holding the device to the light. "O'Malley's original mechanism was a masterpiece of precision engineering. But this secondary trigger, crude, brutal, lacking finesse, was added later by Ashford himself. His panic led him to install additional charges that would have destroyed the entire ballroom, ensuring no witnesses survived, regardless of the primary timer's function. Watson stared at the component with horror, understanding the full scope of Ashford's intended massacre. He would have murdered everyone to protect his reputation. "Fear transforms mediocre men into monsters," Holmes replied, returning the evidence to his drawer. O'Malley was a professional artisan of death. Ashford merely a terrified amateur with a soldering iron. That distinction explains why he broke so completely under questioning. He knew this specific evidence proved his malice exceeded simple complicity. The afternoon sun broke through London's perpetual clouds, casting unexpected brilliance across their familiar sitting room. Holmes returned to his chemical experiments with renewed purpose, while Watson added these final revelations to his chronicle. The frozen ballroom had yielded not merely a solution to impossible murder, but a meditation on the eternal struggle between human nobility and human corruption. "The complete picture emerges only now," Holmes murmured, studying his orange precipitate with satisfaction. "Justice proves more complex than simple punishment of the guilty. It requires vindication of the innocent and preservations of truth against deliberate distortion. Your narrative serves that purpose, Watson. By revealing how one impossible crime was achieved, you render repetition less likely while honoring those who died for their principles." As evening approached and Holmes reached for his coat, suggesting they attend the opera where Mozart's orderly logic might cleanse their minds of human chaos, Watson reflected on the case's broader implications. Outside, London continued its ceaseless rhythm, but within 221B Baker Street, complete truth had finally been illuminated. Complex, nuanced, and ultimately affirming that facts, properly understood and fearlessly pursued, would always triumph over deception. The game, Watson realized as they stepped into the cool London night, was never truly concluded. It merely changed venues and adversaries. Somewhere in the city's fog, new mysteries waited to test their partnership against the endless creativity of human wickedness. But armed with logic, loyalty, and unwavering commitment to truth, they would face whatever impossibilities tomorrow might bring, just as they always had, together. The pale spring sunlight that filtered through the windows of Baker Street seemed to wash away the last vestiges of that terrible winter, yet the memory of the frozen ballroom lingered in our lodgings like the ghost of crystalline death. Holmes sat in his familiar armchair, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of scientific inquiry, chemical apparatus, technical journals, and correspondence from continental scholars whose expertise he had sought in understanding the implications of our recent case. The great detective appeared unusually contemplative as he carefully placed the final documents relating to the Pemberton affair into his dispatch box. Blackwood's diary, O'Malley's technical specifications, and Ashford's confession joined the growing collection of solved mysteries that resided upon our mantelpiece, each case a testament to the triumph of reason over impossibility. "You realize, Watson," Holmes observed, closing the tin box with deliberate finality, "that we have witnessed the dawn of a new era in criminal enterprise. O'Malley was not merely a murderer, but a pioneer, the first of what I fear will become a new breed of scientific assassin." I set aside my completed manuscript, the chronicle of our extraordinary winter adventure, and regarded my friend with interest. His mood had grown increasingly philosophical since the trial's conclusion, as if the case had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the evolution of crime itself. "The frozen ballroom represents more than ingenious murder," he continued, rising to pace before our fire. "It demonstrates how advanced scientific knowledge, when divorced from moral constraint, can transform the impossible into the inevitable. O'Malley possessed expertise in thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and precision engineering, disciplines that should serve humanity's advancement, not its destruction." Holmes moved to his desk, where a half-completed treatise lay open, its pages covered with his characteristic spidery handwriting. "I've been corresponding with Professor Liebig in Munich and Dr. Berthelot in Paris, seeking to understand the full implications of industrial chemistry's criminal applications. Their responses have been illuminating and disturbing in equal measure. "You believe such scientific murders will become more common?" I inquired, though his expression already suggested the answer. "Inevitable, I fear," Holmes replied gravely. "Each year brings fresh discoveries, new applications, new possibilities for both creation and destruction. The detective of tomorrow must be part scientist, part philosopher, capable of understanding not merely human psychology, but the technical means by which that psychology expresses itself." He reached for his violin, tucking it beneath his chin with that familiar gesture that indicated deep thought seeking musical expression. The melody that emerged was complex and melancholic, weaving together themes of triumph and foreboding that seemed to capture the essence of our recent adventure. As he played, I reflected on the human elements that had elevated this case beyond mere technical puzzle. Miss Eleanor Blackwood's quiet courage in defending her father's honor, Lady Pemberton's dignified composure beneath the very instrument designed for her destruction. Yet for all O'Malley's scientific brilliance, I ventured when the music ceased, it was ultimately human virtue that provided the key to justice. Miss Blackwood's evidence, Lady Pemberton's cooperation, even your own moral certainty that truth must prevail. These proved more powerful than any chemical formula. Holmes smiled with uncharacteristic warmth. "An astute observation, Watson. If crime grows more sophisticated, so too must our commitment to justice become more resolute. The tools may evolve, but the eternal struggle between truth and deception remains fundamentally unchanged." The sound of heavy footsteps ascending our stairs interrupted our philosophical discourse, accompanied by the distinctive rhythm of someone carrying both physical and emotional burdens. Holmes set aside his violin with sudden energy, his gray eyes brightening with that familiar gleam of intellectual anticipation. "Our respite concludes, Watson," he announced, moving toward the door with renewed purpose. That tread suggests a man wrestling with circumstances beyond his understanding, precisely the sort of impossible situation that demands our particular expertise. As our visitor's knock echoed through the sitting room, I felt the familiar thrill of approaching mystery. The frozen ballroom had been solved, its secrets exposed, its perpetrators facing justice. Yet Holmes was correct. We had witnessed merely the opening movement of a far more complex symphony. Somewhere in London's fog, other minds were even now considering how science might serve darker purposes. The door opened to reveal a gentleman whose distressed countenance spoke of mysteries yet unsolved, of impossibilities awaiting explanation. Holmes stepped forward with that thin smile Watson had learned to associate with the hunt beginning anew. "The game, my dear Watson," he whispered, his voice trembling with anticipation, "is once again afoot." Outside, London breathed its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the dramas played within its shadows. But here in Baker Street, vigilance remained constant, ready to confront whatever scientific impossibilities the future might bring. The case of the frozen ballroom was complete, filed away among countless solved mysteries. The next adventure had already begun.